full room. Dan is going to be our presenter tonight. We worked with Energize Our Neighborhood to fund a architectural survey of the historic Ustick portion of your larger neighborhood association. And Dan has brought the report, and there's individual house forms up here that you may be able to see some landmarks that you are familiar with and some research that Carrie Davis from Preservation Solutions did. So you're in for a great night, and Dan, of course, is from SHPO, and I'll let him say SHPO.
Absolutely. Carl, would you close that door back there? Thanks. Well, good evening, and thank you to Brandy and the City Department of Arts and History. Thank you to the library at Cole and Ustick, and I want to thank Carrie Davis, who is the principal at architectural history firm called Preservation Solutions. And I'm sorry to say that Carrie has been unwell and regrettably could not be here tonight. We had planned this whole tag team thing where she was going to do some and I was going to do some, and now I'm going to do it all. But she is responsible for any mistakes I make, and she is also responsible for a lot of the content that was developed here, the results that we'll talk about at the end, and some of the recommendations that you'll hear. So Carrie Davis is a lead contributor of all of this, and I just want to acknowledge that and explain her absence now. And I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being here, for being interested in the history of Ustick, in the history of Boise, in the history of the community. And what I think makes Boise a great place to live is the sort of camaraderie of interest that we share in the history of our town, and not just its history, but its future. So I hope today's conversation can end with just that, a conversation about the future of Ustick and this neighborhood. Now, who am I? My name is Dan Everhart. I am an architectural historian, and I am the outreach historian at the Idaho State Historic Preservation Office. Which is what, again? The Idaho State Historic Preservation Office is a department of the Idaho State Historical Society. The State Historical Society is itself a state agency with a governor-appointed board, which works to preserve and protect Idaho's history and culture. And the agency does this in several ways, many of which you'll be familiar with. One of our departments is the State Museum, which recently reopened downtown after a multi-year closure and renovation. That is the State Museum. We also operate, one of our departments is the Idaho State Archives, which is the legally mandated, legislatively mandated repository for all state agency records, including that of our legislature and many other agencies. And it also collects and retains historic documentation from private collections, so individual diaries and photograph collections from across Idaho, all retained at the Idaho State Archives. We also maintain an inventory of state historic sites. The most familiar of that to you will be the Old Idaho Penitentiary, which is owned and managed by the State Historical Society for your benefit. But not only that site, but several others across Idaho, including way up north and way down southeast, where we have a state presence in about 6 different locations around the state of Idaho. And of course, we have the State Historic Preservation Office, where I work. And while our other agencies are devoted to collecting historic artifacts or historic documents, or even managing historic sites, our agency, the State Historic Preservation Office, is responsible for collecting and maintaining Idaho's inventory of historic and archaeological places. That is to say, the records about those places. And the program that you're probably the most familiar with, and one that we'll talk about later on tonight, is the National Register of Historic Places. But there are several other programs overseen by the State Historic Preservation Office, which manages a database of thousands of archaeological and historic sites, their locations, information about their history, where known, etc. And we do this on behalf of the state of Idaho and its citizens so that we can better understand these places and hopefully better protect them. So that's the work that we do, and it makes total sense that we would be interested in collecting information on the town site of Ustick. So I will just briefly go over the background of this project. It just occurs to me as we're standing here that I never considered whether or not there was an advancer. So that means that I might just wander back and forth, advancing, unless I could ask you to do it.
Sure.
How do you feel about that?
What do I got to do?
All you have to do is go like this. Just push this space bar
Oh, I can do that.
when I ask you to. There you go. So we don't need to advance it until I ask. Well, there you go. You'd think I'd given a presentation before, but I guess I don't remember how these things work. If I'm up here, I can't push the button without an advancer. So I'm happy to tell you a little bit about the background of how this project gets started. I think it's obvious to any of you who are from Ustick or live in the Ustick area that there have been a lot of changes to Ustick in the last, well, let's just call it roughly 120 years. So there have been a lot of changes in Ustick, and I think probably the tipping point for interest in those changes was the recent widening of Ustick Road, which definitely had a neighborhood impact, and I think prompted neighbors to request help from the city in better identifying, understanding the historic places in Ustick, and maybe tools that could be used for their preservation. Preservation Solutions, the firm of my colleague Carrie Davis, was hired by the Boise City Department of Arts and History to complete this project, to document these resources and identify methods to preserve them. And we're going to go through some of these things, but first we're going to talk about history, then we're going to talk about what was found, some of her recommendations for moving forward, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for questions and answers should you have them, and I hope you will. Go ahead. All right. Well, it can't go back further than this, which is the sagebrush desert that was home for thousands of years to the Shoshone, Bannock, and Paiute peoples, and which greeted Idaho's earliest settlers who founded the city of Boise in 1863. And yes, in 1863, this is basically what everything looked like in the southern Idaho desert, and it was imperative that if there was going to be any sort of agricultural use of what we think of as the Treasure Valley, that would have to come with irrigation infrastructure. There's insufficient rainfall to water this arid landscape, and irrigation is necessary. And so almost immediately, private investment financed irrigation facilities. Later, that private investment would be replaced by public investment. Federal dollars would build Idaho's irrigation infrastructure, but it began with private investment, including a facility known as the Reidenbach Canal, which by 1878, after its original builder had died, was 7 miles long, had gone from the Boise River up by the magic of gravity, up onto the bench, was about 7 miles long. By 1891, it was 52 miles long and watered thousands of acres of this arid landscape. Go ahead. This is probably the earliest detailed map, you say detailed? Map of the region, and the highlight there is where the Ustick Townsite would be platted. I'll note that because of the irrigation, by the time this map is drawn, there is a notation that says both agricultural land and a second notation that says tall grass and thick sage. So it's clear that if it's agricultural land, maybe that's something that they're wishing for, maybe not something that was actually there. So in this time period, we have the development of the city, and by 1890, Idaho becomes a state. The statehood of Idaho, combined with irrigation development, prompted this dramatic increase in settlement. All of a sudden, Idaho farmland, which just a few years before had been desert, was being advertised all across the country as the place you wanted to live because the land was cheap and plentiful, as was the water. So, in 1894, just 4 years after statehood, Jacob A. Clemens homesteaded the land that would become the town site of Ustick, which immediately became an agricultural landscape. Immediately, I say, in the next 10, 20 years became an agricultural landscape. That agricultural landscape was both served and promoted by the development of certain infrastructure, including the streetcar system. So in 1890, again, the same year as statehood, investors incorporated the region's first electric streetcar system, that is the trolley, in 1890. By 1912, about the time that this map was created, a whole series of streetcar companies had constructed systems across the Boise Valley and allowed access to all of what we think of as our sort of metropolitan areas communities. So not just Nampa and Caldwell, as you see over there above Deer Flat Reservoir, but a whole series of communities across the north side of the river, including Eagle and Star and Middleton, and south across the desert in what was now an agricultural landscape, a whole additional series of towns accessed by this rail line, Meridian, Onweiler, and Ustick there in the highlighted red. Not only did this transport travelers, but it transported goods. Much of the agricultural produce that was coming out of this region was transported to its markets first on the streetcar system. And not only did it connect existing communities, but it spurred the development of new communities as well. Go ahead. Here is a celebration, October 24th, 1905. It is the laying or the pounding of the silver spike to celebrate the beginning of construction of the Boise Valley Railway line between Boise and Nampa. And this distinguished gentleman standing here in his top hat and glasses is Dr. Harlan P. Ustick. Born in Ohio, he was educated there before attending medical school in Philadelphia. He relocated to Boise in 1892, where he immediately, not only was he an eye, ear, nose, and throat doctor, but he invested in mining, in banking, and horticulture. At the time of his death, he owned the third largest commercial orchard in the valley. and real estate, and of course, trolleys. So he's a leading promoter, an investor in the Boise Valley Railway system. And it is Harlan Ustick who conceives the idea of this purpose-built community to both access and promote the Boise Valley Railway line. Harlan and his wife Margaret filed their plat for the Ustick Townsite on May 1st, 1907. This block of land represents 80 acres, and at the north you see 16 small blocks, these top 4 of which have been divided into 22 lots each, and then an additional 8 lots down here, agricultural lots at 5 acres apiece. So the concept was sort of a rural meets urban. You could both have your city lot with a small narrow frontage, or you could have a large farmstead of 5 acres. And of course that doesn't count all of the many surrounding homesteads and farmsteads that would be about the edges of this town site. There was a rectilinear street grid, as you can see, which had the county road at the north. Many of these street names, by the way, have been renamed over the years. So much of what you see there in terms of the original street names have changed. The town site was watered by the Settlers Canal and the North Slough. You see Settlers Ditch there and there running through the town site. And because this is now a good 20 years after irrigation has reached this part of the bench, this town site is noted in the newspaper as being composed of fruit-bearing orchards already. So Harlan Ustick is selling off plots of land that already have fruit-bearing trees. It was most important to note that it is accessed by and promoted for its access or its proximity to the Boise Valley Railway line, which is that dashed or dotted line up along the bottom of the county road. That's critical, of course, to its establishment. Construction began almost immediately on several new commercial buildings. The general store, was completed in 1907. Right across Main Street was the first bank of Ustick, also built in 1907, incorporated with $10,000 in capital. There were plans for a lumber and coal yard, a livery stable, a blacksmith shop, etc. 3 months, only 3 months after the platting of Ustick, the Statesman remarks this way. On July 31st, 1907, they title their article, "Ustick Growing Like a Weed." And they say, quote, "What grows faster than a new town in Idaho? Nothing is the one word that supplies the answer to give, which requires very little thought if one is acquainted with conditions in the gem state. Buildings, quote, buildings have already been erected there, Ustick, and although little effort has been made to sell lots, 28 have already been sold, and now there promises to follow a building craze almost." End quote. It goes on to say a little later, the quote, "The growth of Ustick is attributed more than anything else to the fact that it is on the Boise Valley line." End quote. And social and civic needs, not just commercial needs, but social and civic needs for the new community were met by resources like the Ustick Baptist Church, which dedicated its new brick building in September of 1908. By the way, it cost $1,500 to build and furnish.
Wow.
And many of the women that you see in the picture would have belonged to the Apple Blossom Club, which was a women's civic advancement organization. So not just their religious needs, but sort of their social needs. And those social needs were also met when the post office opened in the Ustick store in 1911. So it was really a community on the rise. Go ahead. In the spring of 1909, a bond was passed by Ustick residents to fund construction of a new school building, which opened to students in November of that year. And all of this was possible because of an economy that was built on farming and agricultural processing, which really formed the backbone of what was happening in Ustick. Here is the Manville Cider and Vinegar Works in about 1913. They're processing apples from all the orchards around the town. Early on, a new conveyor belt mechanism was constructed to load sugar beets directly onto the streetcars, because don't think about where the people were sitting. There were other sorts of what they call rolling stock, that is other sorts of cars, including freight cars, and they had this mechanism to sort of, with a conveyor belt, just load these streetcar cars with sugar beets for easy transport along the rail interurban line over to Nampa and the sugar factory. And in 1917, the new Ustick cheese factory opened. It was part of a larger cooperative dairy organization that operated throughout the Treasure Valley and churned out thousands of pounds of cheese and butter every year from a plant right there in Ustick. The Statesman said, again, this is back in 1907, said, quote, "Many are getting ready to erect dwellings more or less on a substantial modern scale," end quote. The Statesman was always talking about houses being modern. They were always modern and up to date. Never did one build a house that was not modern in Boise. It was always modern. Of course, it was brand new, so how could it help but be modern? But they always wanted to emphasize modern in every respect. Just like this lovely little bungalow and its proud owners. And bungalows, folk Victorians and other styles would have been sort of the rule of the day in Ustick. Very occasionally, you would find a house like this. Now, apologies for it looks a little fuzzy, I know. This was the William and Louisa Briggs house, built in 1910. The Statesman said, quote, "W.M. Briggs is still putting up buildings and will soon have one of the finest country homes in the state." And I think there's no arguing. It was certainly a fine home for Ustick in 1910. This would have been atypical, not the norm, but a little bit atypical. Here are the boys from Ustick High School, the basketball team, and what I really like you to note, you can look at their faces, sure, but look at the open expanse of Ustick. And you can see in the background, you can see the store on the right and the back of the bank on the left. And very little else. There's one of those fruit trees that has, what, 3 leaves on it. So Ustick soon became a wayfinding reference point on the West Boise Bench, in this area where you would have just had farm fields and farm houses as far as the eye could see. Ustick became a place that people would reference as a location. By 1912, just 5 years after the town is platted, the county road, which until then was just the county road, had become to be generally referred to as Ustick Road. It was the way to get to Ustick and the road on which Ustick sat. So as early as 1912, Ustick Road. And the Idaho Statesman, in its very regular sort of social gossip columns, would talk about not just Cuna, not just Eagle, not just Meridian, but the goings on, the social goings on in the town of Ustick. So it became its own place with its own identity, and it was very much a going concern. Despite all of that optimism, despite all of that planning for the future and what could be, ultimately Ustick never lived up to the expectations. And it started with the Ustick Bank, which closed in 1911, only 4 years after opening. They had some problems with liquidity, and that was not good for their investors. More than that, most of the blocks and lots in the town site sold, but remained undeveloped or underdeveloped. So there wasn't the sort of boom of residential construction that maybe Harlan and Margaret had hoped for. And then by 1928, the automobile makes the streetcar obsolete. So its location along the streetcar is no longer important, and you could build a factory or a house anywhere that your automobile could reach. The disappearance of the orchards made the community less self-sustaining, and the Ustick School, which had graduated dozens of classes all the way through high school, closed in 1959, and the new elementary school was opened about a mile down the road, far outside of the original Ustick town site. The post office closed in 1978. The general store closed not too long after that. In the 1970s, of course, urban sprawl began to replace these rural landscapes, and the first of those was in 1972, when 75 acres on the southeast corner of 5 Mile and Ustick were subdivided for 257 homes in a development called Camelot. Between 1975 and 1982, another 110 acres just north of Ustick Road were subdivided into 353 houses for lots in what was called the Frontier subdivision. So this aerial view shows you what Ustick looked like in 1964. And if you'll advance the slide, you'll see what Ustick looked like in 1986. So in just the span of 20 years, this major suburban encroachment on what had been a rural community. Here's Camelot, here's Frontier, and right here at the corner there is, of course, the Maple Tree Plaza Strip Mall and Shopping Center from 1985, which sort of replaced any need for any commercial use of what had once been the town of Ustick. You didn't need a tiny little general store if you had a massive Albertsons right next door. So everything that had sort of defined Ustick as a community really evaporated following about 1970. Go ahead. Ustick was then annexed by the city of Boise in 1995, and the subsequent 25 years of continued growth which I don't have to tell you about, has seen the widening of the road, led citizens to ask what is left and what could one do to protect it. This aerial view is from 1976, and while you can see Ustick pretty well intact here, you can see the coming menace of the subdivision to the north there. So that's history. Let's talk about what was discovered in this inventory and a little bit about how that inventory was done. So there were a few different aspects to Carrie's work. The first of that being research to get existing documentation that had already been collected, primary and secondary sources, city and county records, some local interviews. All of that then went into informing what would be the field study, which was to be a building by building analysis of what exists within the survey boundary, and you'll see those boundaries in a moment. Photographs were taken of every site in the boundary. Those photos are exterior only, and certain elements of the streetscape were studied, and then of course all of that information was analyzed and synthesized so that we could better understand it. Just as an FYI, of course, that's the Merck in about 1915 at the top, and in 1966 at the bottom when it's still an operating post office. And what's interesting, and it might be difficult to see this, do you see just to the right of her shoulder is this sort of arched opening? That's this arched opening. Of course, you're seeing the front and then the back. But that's where you would have gone to collect your mail. Go ahead. So, the survey, the documentation of these buildings includes an analysis of whether or not the properties retain integrity. And integrity, if you want to be formal, is the authenticity of a property's historic identity, evidenced by the survival of physical characteristics that existed during the property's historic period. What does that mean? It means it looks much as it did when it was built, or during the period in which it was important. Maybe that period wasn't for 20 more years, but it has to look like it did during that significant time period or during its or immediately after construction. It means that buildings must retain and communicate their historic elements, so original siding, original windows, original forms, and occasionally alterations that are made during that historic time period can themselves be important. Even if they're not original to the building, a change can be important if it was during the time period's significance. So go to the next slide, please. So the findings basically relate to 42 specific sites. 8 of those sites are eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. 27 are not eligible for listing in the National Register, and the other 7 are not yet historic. That comprises that 42 number. There is what Carrie proposes and what the SHPO agrees. The State Historic Preservation Office is often called the SHPO, SHPO. What the SHPO agrees to be a district, a small district eligible for listing as a district, which would be, and we'll talk about it in a little more detail, basically it would encapsulate the 4 buildings that you see there fronting Ustick Road. Starting with the Merck, the bank, the cheese factory, and a house there at the top. There are also some individually eligible properties. That is to say, they're not part of a larger district, but are individually eligible for listing in the National Register. And then we're going to talk about another tool, which is not the National Register, but a tool that city planners use called a conservation district. This is the survey boundary for the survey area, and I will just mention as an aside, there were a few individual properties that Carrie was asked to look at that fall outside of this boundary. So there are a few properties up and down Ustick that were reviewed and included in those numbers that I mentioned already, but the concentration of effort was put inside the bold line there that you see. And just to be clear, though the key tells you, those properties in black are eligible for listing in the National Register. That includes the Spangenberg Farm, which we'll talk about, the Ustick School, which we'll talk about, and that red outline is that small proposed district. The rest of the properties, as you can see, are shaded in gray, means that they have changed too much to be eligible for the National Register. And then there are several clusters of infill housing, very thin row houses, one up against another there, that were not included in the documentation as they are simply too new to be surveyed and are obviously not historic. Even though they're not historic, they have a profound impact and are having a profound impact on the character of Ustick as a community. Let's go to the next slide. So first, the district, which we already have talked about a little bit. There are 4 properties in that district. At the upper left, you see the Ustick Merc. At the upper right, the bank. At the lower left, that is the Ustick Cheese Factory. And down here is the Grimmett Thompson House. Carrie proposed and our office agreed that this district could be eligible for listing in the National Register, which would include a much more thorough documentation process and would require the consent of at least 50% plus one of the owners. So if you do the math real quick, that probably means 3 of these properties would have to agree to National Register listing in that district. Go ahead to the next slide. There are a series of 4 individually eligible properties. The William and Louisa Briggs Ranch, that is to say the house at the upper left. The L.C. Bowers house down here at the lower left, which was constructed in downtown Boise in 1908, moved to its location along Ustick in 1958, and now sort of sits in the middle of a subdivision at the end of a cul-de-sac. It's a little off its original feeling, but because of its architecture and its design, which was completed by Turtelot and Hummel, the famous architectural firm, it would still be individually eligible for listing. The school here from 1909 does not look like that anymore. It's had some alterations and additions, and more information would be necessary, but it is still eligible for listing and in fact has already been listed in the National Register in 1982 as part of a series of schoolhouses around Idaho. Next slide. The final and 4th of the individual properties which is eligible is seen here in all 4 images. This is the Spangenberg Farm, built as early as, but possibly even a year or so before 1909. The house, which you can see in the upper left, has been quite significantly altered, particularly in its siding and its windows. But despite the alterations to the house, the rest of the property, including original outbuildings like this barn, and its pretty large acreage of open agricultural land. So despite despite changes to the house itself, the larger collection of the land, the outbuildings, the farmstead as a whole would be eligible for listing in the National Register. Go ahead. So what does that mean exactly? Well, first and foremost, National Register listing is an honorific designation. That is it. It is simply to acknowledge the history and significance of a place. It is not a program to dictate to a property owner what they may or may not do with their property. It simply isn't, and there's a lot of confusion about that. We can talk more at length, but I will stick to my guns because it's not a program for protecting places. It's a program for designating and giving honorific accolade to a site for its significance. Archaeology, architecture, etc. But the National Register, in addition to being a recognition of historic significance, has, and I probably wouldn't have worded it exactly this way, sorry Carrie, minor protections from federal undertakings. If, for instance, the National Register eligible or listed Merck and Bank were to be impacted by a road widening that was funded by the federal government, which most road projects are, there would be a process to review that project and consider the impacts on a National Register listed or eligible place. But you notice I slipped in a word, eligible. It doesn't have to be listed to have that review process take place. It can simply be eligible for listing. And there are some financial incentives to property owners who have their properties listed in the National Register. Generally speaking, these incentives are meant for income-producing properties. So the Merck and the bank, maybe the cheese factory, these could all take an incentive through the federal tax credit program because of listing in the National Register. So there are some incentives to National Register listing, but the chief incentive is to draw awareness to or honor the significance of a place and its history. Go ahead. There's another concept which Carrie is suggesting the city could explore, and that is a conservation district. Now, the National Register is honorific, and local planning and zoning ordinance is where honorific turns to required. What the city has right now is a program for listing local historic districts. There are several of these, about 13 in the city of Boise. Only one of those is on the bench. It's just right over here, the Spalding Ranch. Most of them are closer to the downtown core. Think Warm Springs Boulevard or Harrison. Warm Springs Avenue or Harrison Boulevard. In these districts, the city's Historic Preservation Commission has the authority under state and city law to tell the property owners what they may and may not do to alter the properties. Generally speaking, those districts must be eligible for listing in the National Register as a district. And because the larger Ustick neighborhood does not meet that threshold, it would probably not qualify for designation by the city as a local historic district. However, there is another option called a conservation district. And a conservation district, without getting in the weeds too much, is sort of a choose your own adventure of oversight by the city. If you as a community, property owners, wish to see certain elements of your community protected, you might choose from a list of things that you might want to see protected. Maybe it doesn't matter to you if all of the windows in your neighbor's house the historic windows are taken out and replaced with new windows. but maybe it does matter if your neighbor's house is demolished and 14 row houses go in next door. So the city has a possible solution in the conservation district. That conservation district concept has been employed in Boise before. Probably its most successful is down in the Collister neighborhood just north of State Street, where an overlay of a conservation district was put in place to preserve a semi-rural character, which allowed certain things like having horses inside city limits. So the city has designated at least one conservation district in the past. It's possible that they could designate a new conservation district in Ustick. And Carrie's recommendation is that some of those things that the community might wish to protect in Ustick could include things like roadways without curbs and sidewalks that just have a gravel shoulder, which looks very rural because it is. You can see the distinct difference between a rural roadway shoulder and an urban shoulder. Mature trees, of course, are important in Ustick, and maybe those could be protected. Wood and barbed wire fencing. Open pasture